Chapter 35. The Cold War Begins. 1945 to 1952. The United States stands at this moment at the summit of the world. Winston Churchill, 1945. The American people, 140 million strong, cheered their nation's victories in Europe and in Asia at the conclusion of World War II. But before the shouting had even faded, many Americans began to worry about their future. 4 fiery years of global war had not entirely driven from their minds the painful memories of 12 desperate years of the Great Depression. Still more ominously, victory celebrations had barely ended before America's crumbling relations with its wartime ally, the Soviet Union, threatened a new and even more terrible international conflict. Truman, the gunny man from Missouri. Presiding over the opening of the post-war period was an accidental president, Harry S. Truman. Trim and owlishly bespectacled, with his graying hair and friendly and toothy grin, Truman was called the average man's average man. Even his height, 5 feet 8 inches, was average. Though the first president in many years without a college education, he had farmed, served as an artillery officer in France during World War I, and failed as a harbor-dasher. He then tried his hand at precinct-level Missouri politics, through which he rose from a judgeship to the U.S. Senate. Though a protege of a notorious political machine in Kansas City, he had managed to keep his own hands clean. The problems of the post-war period were staggering, and the suddenly burdened new president at first approached his task with humility, but gradually he evolved from a shrinking pipsqueak into a scrappy little cuss, gaining confidence to the point of cockiness. When the Soviet foreign minister complained, "I've never been talked to like that in my life," Truman shot back, "Carry out your arguments, and you won't get talked to like that," Truman later boasted. "I gave him the 1-2, right to the jaw." A smallish man thrust suddenly into a giant job, Truman permitted designing old associates of the Missouri gang to gather around him and, like Grant, was stubbornly loyal to them when they were caught with cream on their whiskers. On occasion, he would send critics hot-tempered and profane SOB letters. Most troubling, he was inclined to go off half-cocked or stick maliciously to a wrong-headed notion. To err is Truman, cynics jibed. But if he was sometimes small in the small things, he was often big in the big things. He had down-home authenticity, few pretensions, rock-solid probity, and a lot of that old-fashioned character trait called moxie. Not one to dodge responsibility, he placed a sign on his White House desk that read, "The buck stops here." Among his favorite sayings was, "If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen." His mettle would be tested as tensions with Russia heated up. Yalta, bargain or betrayal. Vast and silent, the Soviet Union continued to be the great enigma. The conference at Tehran in 1943, where Roosevelt first met Joseph Stalin man-to-man, had cleared the air somewhat, but much remained unresolved, especially questions about the post-war phases of Germany, Eastern Europe, and Asia. The Yalta Conference, the final fateful meeting of the Big Three, took place in February 1945. At this former Tsarist resort, on the relatively warm shores of the Black Sea, Stalin, Churchill, and the fast-failing Roosevelt reached momentous agreements after pledging their faith with vodka. Final plans were laid for smashing the buckling German lines and assigning occupation zones in Germany to the victorious powers. Stalin agreed that Poland, with revised boundaries, should have a representative government based on free elections, a pledge he soon broke. Bulgaria and Romania were likewise to have free elections, a promise also flouted. The Big Three. Of all the grave decisions at Yalta, the most controversial concerned the Far East. The atomic bombs had not yet been tested, and Washington strategists expected frightful American casualties in the projected assault on Japan. From Roosevelt's standpoint, it seemed highly desirable that Stalin should enter the Asian War, pin down Japanese troops in Manchuria and Korea, and lighten American losses. Stalin, striking a hard bargain, agreed to attack Japan within 3 months after the collapse of Germany. In return, the Soviets were promised the southern half of Sakhalin Island, lost to Japan in 1905. Japan's Kuril Islands, and control over the railroads and 2 key seaports in China's Manchuria. As it turned out, Moscow's muscle was not necessary to knock out Japan. Critics charged that Roosevelt had sold Jiang Jishi's down the river when he conceded control of Manchuria to Stalin. The consequent undermining of Chinese morale, so the accusation ran, contributed powerfully to Jiang's overthrow by the Communists 4 years later. The critics also assailed the sellout of Poland and other Eastern European countries. Roosevelt's defenders countered that Stalin, with his mighty Red Army, could have secured much more of China if he had wished, and that the Yalta Conference really set limits on his ambition. Apologists for Roosevelt also contended that if Stalin had kept his promise to support free elections in Poland and the liberated Balkans, the future of the U.S.-Soviet relations would have looked different. At the time of Yalta, Soviet troops occupied much of Eastern Europe. Any war to throw them out was unthinkable. The fact is that the Big Three at Yalta were not drafting a comprehensive peace settlement. At most, they were stretching general intentions and testing one another's reactions. Later, critics who howled about broken promises overlooked that fundamental point. More specific understandings among the wartime allies, especially the two emerging superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, awaited the arrival of peace. The United States and the Soviet Union. History provided little hope that the United States and the Soviet Union would reach cordial understandings about the shape of the post-war world. Mutual suspicions were ancient, abundant, and abiding. Communism and capitalism were historically hostile social philosophies. The United States had refused officially to recognize the Bolshevik revolutionary government in Moscow until it was 16 years old, in 1933. Soviet skepticism towards the West was nourished by the British and American delays in opening up a second front against Germany, while the Soviet army paid a grisly toll to roll the Nazi invaders back across Russia and Eastern Europe. Britain and America had also frozen their Soviet, quote, ally, unquote, out of the project to develop atomic weapons, further feeding Stalin's mistrust. The Washington government rubbed salt in Soviet wounds when it abruptly terminated vital Lend-Lease aid to a battered USSR in 1945 and spurned Moscow's plea for a $6 billion reconstruction loan, while approving a similar loan of $3.75 billion to Britain in 1946. Different visions of the post-war world also separated the two superpowers. Stalin aimed above all to guarantee the security of the Soviet Union. The USSR had twice in the 20th century been stabbed in its heartland by attacks across the windswept plains of Eastern Europe. Stalin made it clear from the outset of the war that he was determined to have friendly governments along the Soviet western border, especially in Poland. By maintaining an extensive Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern and Central Europe, the USSR could protect itself and consolidate its revolutionary base as the world's leading communist country. To many Americans, that sphere of influence looked like an ill-gamed empire. Doubting that Soviet goals were purely defensive, they remembered the earlier Bolshevik call for world revolution. Stalin's emphasis on spheres also clashed with Franklin Roosevelt's Wilsonian dream of an open world, decolonized, demilitarized, and democratized, with a strong international organization to oversee global peace. Even the ways in which the United States and the Soviet Union resembled each other were troublesome. Both countries had been largely isolated from the world affairs before World War II, the United States through choice, the Soviet Union through rejection by the other powers. Both nations had a history of conducting a kind of missionary diplomacy, trying to export to all the world the political doctrines precipitated out of their respective revolutionary origins. Unaccustomed to their great power roles, unfamiliar with or even antagonistic to each other, and each believing in their own universal applicability of its own particular ideology, America and the USSR suddenly found themselves staring eyeball to eyeball over the prostrate body of a battered Europe. In these circumstances, some sort of confrontation was virtually unavoidable. The wartime Grand Alliance of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain had been a misbegotten child of necessity. When the hated Hitler fell, suspicion and rivalry between communistic, despotic Russia and capitalistic, democratic America were all but inevitable. In a fateful progression of events marked often by misperceptions as well as genuine conflicts of interest. The two powers provoked each other into a tense standoff known as the Cold War. Enduring 4.5 decades, the Cold War not only shaped Soviet-American relations, it overshadowed the entire post-war international order in every corner of the globe. Shaping the post-war world. Despite these obstacles, the United States did manage, at the war's end, to erect some of the structures that would support Roosevelt's vision of an open world. The Atlantic Charter that he and Churchill had promulgated in 1941 proclaimed for all nations the rights to self-determination and free access to trade, while committing to a post-war international system designed to ensure the human rights to freedom from fear and want for all individuals everywhere. As victory approached, the Western Allies worked to build the institutions that would embody those lofty goals. At the Bretton Woods Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944, the Western Allies established the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to encourage world trade by regulating currency exchange rates. They also founded the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, World Bank, to promote economic growth in war-ravaged and underdeveloped areas. 3 years later, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, reduced trade barriers among member nations and helped to form the basis for transformative spread of economic globalization in the latter half of the century. In contrast to its behavior after World War I, the United States took the lead in creating these important international bodies and supplied most of their funding. Victorious and robust at the end of the conflict that had laid waste to all the traditional great powers, America was uniquely positioned to shape the world order after World War II. The emerging Cold War conflict, meanwhile, ensured that the Soviets and those within their sphere of influence would largely decline to participate in many of the new multilateral institutions. The emerging global order extended international governance to realms beyond economics. As flags swept at half-mast, the United Nations Conference opened on schedule, April 25, 1945, despite Roosevelt's dismaying death 13 days earlier. Unlike Woodrow Wilson with his League of Nations, Roosevelt had truly moved to establish the new international body before the war's conclusion, so as to capitalize on the wartime spirit of cooperation and insulate planning for the United Nations from the potentially divisive issue of the peace settlement. Meeting at the San Francisco War Memorial Opera House, representatives from 50 nations fashioned the United Nations Charter. The United States took a leading role in shaping and funding the new organization. But, in contrast to its absentation from other post-war economic institutions, the Soviet Union expected to be a key participant in this body. The United Nations, UN, was a successor to the old League of Nations, but it differed from its predecessor in significant ways. Born in a moment of idealism and designed to prevent another great power war, the League had adopted rules denying the veto power to any party to a dispute. The UN, by contrast, more realistically provided that no member of the Security Council, dominated by the Big Five powers, the United States, Britain, the USSR, France, and China, could have action taken against it without its consent. The League, in short, presumed great power conflict. The UN presumed great power cooperation. Both approaches had their liabilities. The UN also featured the General Assembly, which could be controlled by smaller countries. In contrast to the Chile-American reception of the League in 1919, the Senate overwhelmingly approved the UN Charter on July 28, 1945, by a vote of 89-2. Not least because it provided safeguards for American sovereignty and freedom of action. The United Nations, setting up its permanent glass home in New York City, had some gratifying initial successes. It helped preserve peace in Iran, Kashmir, and other trouble spots. It played a large role in creating the new Jewish state of Israel. The UN Trusteeship Council guided former colonies to independence. Through such arms as UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, and WHO, World Health Organization, the UN brought benefits to peoples the world over. The fearsome new technology of the atom, however, put to an early test the spirit of cooperation on which the UN had been founded. The new organization failed this test badly. U.S. Delegate Bernard Baruch called in 1946 for a UN agency free from the great power veto with worldwide authority over atomic energy, weapons, and research. The Soviet delegate encountered that the possession of nuclear weapons should simply be outlawed by every nation. President Truman said that it would be folly to throw away our gun until we are sure that the rest of the world can't arm against us. The suspicious Soviets felt the same way and used their veto power to scuttle the proposals. A priceless opportunity to tame the nuclear monster in infancy was lost. The problem of Germany. Hitler's ruined Reich posed especially thorny problems for all the wartime allies. They agreed only that the cancer of Nazism had to be cut out of the German body politic, which involved punishing Nazi leaders for war crimes. The Allies joined in, trying 22 top culprits at the Nuremberg war crimes trials during 1945 to 1946. Accusations included committing crimes against laws of war and humanity and plotting aggressions contrary to solemn treaty pledges. Justice, Nuremberg style, was harsh. 12 of the accused Nazis swung from the gallows, and 7 were sentenced to long jail terms. Foxy Hermann Goering, whose blubbery chest had once blazed with ribbons, cheated the hangman a few hours before his scheduled execution by swallowing a hidden cyanide capsule. The trials of several small fry Nazis continued for years. Some legal critics in America and elsewhere condemned these proceedings as judicial lynchings, because the victims were tried for offenses that had not been clear-cut crimes when the war began. Beyond punishing the top Nazis, the Allies could agree on little about post-war Germany. Some American Hitler haters, noting that an industrialized Germany had been a brutal aggressor, at first wanted to dismantle German factories and reduce the country to a potato patch. The Soviets, denied American economic assistance, were determined to rebuild their shattered land by extracting enormous reparations from the Germans. Both these desires clashed headlong with the reality that an industrial, healthy German economy was indispensable to the recovery of Europe. Along with Austria, Germany had been divided at war's end into 4 military occupation zones, each assigned to one of the big 4 powers: France, Britain, America, and the USSR. The Western Allies refused to allow Moscow to bleed their zones of the reparations that Stalin insisted he had been promised at Yalta. They also began to promote the idea of a reunited Germany. The Communists responded by tightening their grip on the Eastern Zone. Before long, it was apparent that Germany would remain indefinitely divided. West Germany eventually became an independent country. Wedded to the West, East Germany, along with the other Soviet-dominated Eastern European countries, such as Poland and Hungary, became nominally independent satellite states, bound to the Soviet Union. Eastern Europe virtually disappeared from Western sight behind the Iron Curtain of secrecy and isolation that Stalin clanged down across Europe from the Baltic to the Adriatic. This division of Europe would endure for more than 4 decades. With Germany now split in 2, there remained the problem of the rubble heap known as Berlin. Lying deep within the Soviet zone, this beleaguered isle in the Red Sea had been broken, like Germany as a whole, into sectors occupied by troops of each of the 4 victorious powers. In 1948, following controversies over German currency reform and power control, the Soviets abruptly choked off all rail and highway access to Berlin. They evidently reasoned that the Allies would be starved out. Berlin became a hugely symbolic issue for both sides. At stake was not only the fate of a city, but a test of wills between Moscow and Washington. The Americans organized a gigantic Berlin airlift in the midst of a hair-trigger tension for nearly a year, flying some of the very aircraft that had recently dropped bombs on Berlin. American pilots ferried thousands of tons of supplies a day to the grateful Berliners, their former enemies. Western Europeans took heart from this vivid demonstration of America's determination to honor its commitments in Europe. The Soviets, their bluff dramatically called out, finally lifted their blockade. In May 1949, in the same year, the governments of two Germanys, East and West, were formally established. The Cold War had icily congealed. Cold War deepens, as crafty Stalin also probed the West's resolve at other sensitive points, including oil-rich Iran. Seeking to secure oil concessions similar to those held by the British and Americans, Stalin in 1946 broke an agreement to remove his troops from Iran's northernmost province, which the USSR had occupied during World War II. Instead, he used troops to aid a rebel movement. Truman sent off a stinging protest, and the Soviet dictator backed down. Moscow's hardline policies in Germany, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East wrought a psychological Pearl Harbor. The eyes of Americans were jarred wide open by the Kremlin's apparent unwillingness to continue the wartime partnership. Any remaining goodwill from the period of comradeship in arms evaporated in a cloud of dark distrust. "I'm tired of babying the Soviets," Truman remarked privately in 1946, as attitudes on both sides began to harden frostily. Truman's piecemeal promises to various Soviet challenges took on intellectual coherence in 1947, with the formulation of the containment doctrine. Crafted by a brilliant young diplomat and Soviet specialist, George F. Kennan, this concept held that Russia, whether Tsarist or communist, was relentlessly expansionary. But the Kremlin was also cautious, Kennan argued, and the flow of Soviet power into every nook and cranny available to it could be stemmed by firm and vigilant containment. Truman embraced Kennan's advice when he formally and publicly adopted a "get tough with Russia" policy in 1947. His first dramatic move was triggered by a word that heavily burdened Britain could no longer bear the financial and military load of defending Greece against communist pressures. If Greece fell, Turkey would presumably collapse, and the strategic eastern Mediterranean would pass into Soviet orbit. In a surprise appearance, the president went before Congress on March 12, 1947, and requested support for what would come to known as the Truman Doctrine. Specifically, he asked for $400 million to bolster Greece and Turkey, which Congress quickly granted. More generally, he declared that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures, a sweeping and open-ended commitment of vast and worrisome proportions. Critics then and later charged that Truman had overreacted by promising unlimited support to any tin-horn despot who claimed to be resisting communist aggression. Critics also complained that the Truman Doctrine needlessly polarized the world into pro-Soviet and pro-American camps and unwisely construed the Soviet threat as primarily military in nature. Apologists for Truman have explained that it was Truman's fear of a revised isolationism that led him to exaggerate the Soviet threat and to pitch his message in the charged language of a holy global war against godless communism. Meanwhile, a threat of a different sort loomed in Eastern Europe, especially France, Italy, and Germany. These key nations were still suffering from the hunger and economic chaos spawned by war. They were in grave danger of being taken over from the inside by communist parties that could exploit these hardships. President Truman responded with a bold policy, in keeping with America's post-war desire for a liberalized global economy. In a commencement address at Harvard University on June 5, 1947, Secretary of State George C. Marshall invited the Europeans to get together and work out a joint plan for their economic recovery. If they did so, then the United States would provide substantial financial assistance. This forced cooperation constituted a powerful nudge on the road to the eventual creation of the European Community, EC. The democratic nations of Europe rose enthusiastically to the life-giving bait of the so-called Marshall Plan. They met in Paris in July 1947 to thrash out the details. There, Marshall offered the same aid to the Soviet Union and its allies, if they would make political reforms and accept certain outside controls In fact, the Americans worried that the Russian bear might hug the Marshall Plan to death, and therefore made the terms deliberately difficult for the USSR to accept. Nobody was surprised when the Soviets walked out, denouncing the Marshall Plan as one more capitalist trick. The Marshall Plan called for spending $12.5 billion over 4 years in 16 cooperating countries. Congress at first balked at this mammoth sum. It looked even huger when added to the nearly $2 billion the United States had already contributed to Europe through the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, and the hefty American contributions to the United Nations, IMF, and World Bank. But a Soviet-sponsored communist coup in Czechoslovakia finally awakened the legislators to reality, and they voted the initial appropriations in April 1948. Congress evidently concluded that if Uncle Sam did not get the Europeans back on their feet, they would never get off his back. Truman's Marshall Plan was a spectacular success. American dollars pumped reviving blood into the economic veins of the anemic Western European nations. Within a few years, most of them were exceeding their pre-war outputs, as an economic miracle drenched Europe in prosperity. The communist parties in Italy and France lost ground, and these two keystone countries were saved from the westward thrust of communism. A resolute Truman made another fateful decision in 1948. Access to Middle Eastern oil was crucial to the European recovery program and increasingly to the health of the U.S. economy, given finite American oil reserves. Yet the Arab oil countries adamantly opposed the creation of the Jewish state of Israel in the British Mandate territory of Palestine. Should Israel be born, a Saudi Arabian leader warned Truman, the Arabs will lay siege to it until it dies of famine. Defying Arab wrath, as well as the objections of his own state and defense departments and the European allies, Truman officially recognized the State of Israel on the day of its birth, May 14, 1948. Humanitarian sympathy for the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust ranked high among his reasons, as did his wish to preempt Soviet influence in the Jewish state and to retain the support of American Jewish voters. Truman's policy of strong support for Israel would vastly complicate U.S. relations with the Arab world in the decades ahead. America begins to rearm. The Cold War, the struggle to contain Soviet communism, was not war, yet it was not peace. The standoff with the Kremlin banished the dreams of tax-fatigued Americans that tanks could be beamed into automobiles. The Soviet menace spurred the unification of the armed services, as well as the creation of a new national security apparatus. Congress in 1947 passed the National Security Act, creating the Department of Defense. The department was to be housed in the sprawling Pentagon building on the banks of the Potomac, and to be headed by a new cabinet officer, the Secretary of Defense. Under the Secretary, but without cabinet status, were the civilian secretaries of the Navy, the Army, replacing the old Secretary of War, and the Air Force, a recognition of the rising importance of air power. The uniformed heads of each service were brought together as the Chief Joints of Staff. The National Security Act also established the National Security Council, NSC, to advise the President on security matters, and the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, to coordinate the government's foreign fact-gathering. The Voice of America, authorized by Congress in 1948, began beaming American radio broadcasts behind the Iron Curtain. In the same year, Congress resurrected the military draft, providing for the conscription of selected young men from the 19 to 25 years of age. The forbidding presence of the Selective Service Program system shaped millions of young people's education, marital, and career plans in the following quarter century. One shoe at a time, the war-weary America was reluctantly returning to a war footing. The Soviet threat was forcing the democracies of Western Europe into an unforeseen degree of unity. In 1948, Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg signed a path-breaking treaty of defensive alliance at Brussels. Then they invited the United States to join them. The proposal confronted the United States with a historic decision. America had traditionally avoided entangling alliances, especially in peacetime, if the Cold War could be considered peacetime. Yet American participation in the emerging coalition could serve many purposes. It would strengthen the policy of containing the Soviet Union. It would provide a framework of the reintegration of Germany into the European family and would reassure jittery Europeans that a traditionally isolationist Uncle Sam was not about to abandon them to the marauding Russian bear, or to a resurgent and domineering Germany. The Truman administration decided to join the European Pact, called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and thereby grant it a transatlantic character. With white-tie pageantry, the NATO treaty was signed in Washington on April 4th, 1949. The 12 original signatories pledged to regard an attack on one as an attack on all, and promised to respond with armed force if necessary. Despite last-ditch howls from immovable isolationists, the Senate approved the treaty on July 21st, 1949, by a vote of 82 to 13. Membership was boosted to 14 in 1952 with the inclusion of Greece and Turkey, to 15 in 1955 with the addition of West Germany. The NATO Pact was epochal. It marked a dramatic departure from American diplomatic convention, a gigantic boost for European unification, and a significant step in the militarization of the Cold War. NATO became the cornerstone of all Cold War American policy towards Europe. With good reason, pundits summed up NATO's threefold purpose: to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. Reconstruction and revolution in Asia. Reconstruction in Japan was simpler than in Germany, primarily because it was largely a one-man and one-army show. The occupying American army, under the Supreme Allied Commander, five-star General Douglas MacArthur, sat in the driver's seat. In the teeth of violent protests from Soviet officials, MacArthur went inflexibly ahead with his program for democratization of Japan. Following the pattern in Germany, top Japanese war criminals were tried in Tokyo from 1946 to 1948. 18 of them were sentenced to prison terms, and 7 were hanged. General MacArthur, as a kind of Yankee Mikado, enjoyed stunning success. The Japanese cooperated to an astonishing degree. They saw that good behavior and the adoption of democracy would speed the end of the occupation, as it did. A MacArthur-dictated constitution was adopted in 1946. It renounced militarism, provided for women's equality, and introduced Western-style democratic government, paving the way for a phenomenal economic recovery that, within a few decades, made Japan one of the world's mightiest industrial powers. Ironically, as with the U.S. supported recovery of Western European economies, Japan's post-war ascendance eventually helped to end America's honeymoon as the unchallenged global economic kingpin. Despite such ironies, Japan proved an uncontestable post-war success story for American policymakers. The opposite was true in China, where a bitter civil war had raged for years between nationalists and communists. Washington had half-heartedly supported the nationalist government of the Generalissimo Zhang Jieshi in his struggle with the communists under Mao Zedong. But ineptitude and corruption within the Generalissimo's regime gradually corroded the confidence of his people. Communist armies swept south, and late in 1949, Zhang was forced to flee with the remnants of his once powerful force to the last hope island of Formosa, Taiwan. The collapse of nationalist China was a depressing defeat for America and its allies in the Cold War, the worst to date. At one fell swoop, nearly one-fourth of the world's population, some 500 million people, was swept into the communist camp. The so-called fall of China became a bitter partisan issue in the United States. The Republicans, seeking out those who had lost China, assailed President Truman and his bristly-mustached Secretary of State, Dean Acheson. They insisted that democratic agencies, wormy with communists, had deliberately withheld aid from Zhang Jieshi to trip him into his fall. More bad news came in September 1949 when President Truman shocked the nation by announcing that Soviets had exploded an atomic bomb, approximately 3 years earlier than many experts had thought possible. American strategists since 1945 had counted on keeping the Soviets in line by threats of a one-sided aerial attack with nuclear weapons. But atomic bombing was now a game that two could play. To outpace the Soviets in nuclear weaponry, Truman ordered the development of the H-bomb, hydrogen bomb, a sea-smashing thermonuclear weapon that was 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. J. Robert Oppenheimer, former scientific director of the Manhattan Project and current chair of the Atomic Energy Commission, led a group of scientists in opposition to the program to design thermonuclear weapons on the grounds that it approached genocide. Albert Einstein, the physicist whose theories had helped give birth to the atomic age, declared that annihilation of any life on Earth has been brought within the range of technical possibilities. But Einstein and Oppenheimer, the nation's two most famous scientists, could not dissuade Truman. Anxious over communist threats in East Asia from proceeding with the H-bomb, the United States exploded its first hydrogen device on a South Pacific atoll in 1952. Not to be outdone, the Soviets countered with their first H-bomb explosion in 1953. The nuclear arms race had entered a perilously competitive cycle. Spurred on by a massive state support for defense-related scientific research in both countries, it was only constrained by the recognition that a truly hot Cold War would leave no world for the communists to communize or the democracies to democratize. Peace through mutual terror brought a shaky stability to the superpower standoff. The Korean volcano erupts. Korea, the land of the morning calm, heralded a new and more disturbing phase of the Cold War, a shooting phase in 1950. When Japan collapsed in 1945, Soviet troops had accepted the Japanese surrender north of the 38th parallel on the Korean peninsula, and American troops had done likewise south of that line. Both superpowers had professed to want the reunification and independence of Korea, a Japanese colony since 1910. But as in Germany, each helped to set up rival regimes above and below the parallel. In 1949, when the Soviets and Americans had both withdrawn their forces, the entire peninsula was bristling armed camp with two hostile regimes eyeing each other suspiciously. The explosion came on June 25, 1950. Spearheaded by Soviet-made tanks, North Korean Army columns rumbled across the 38th parallel. Caught flat-footed, the South Korean forces were shoved back southward to a dangerously tiny defense around Busan, the wary backs to the sea. President Truman sprang quickly into the breach. The invasion seemed to provide devastating proof of a fundamental premise in the containment doctrine that shaped Washington's foreign policy. Even a slight relaxation of America's guard was an invitation to communist aggression somewhere. The Korean invasion prompted a massive expansion of the American military. A few months before, Truman's National Security Council had issued its famous National Security Council Memorandum number 68, NSC 68, recommending that the United States quadruple its defense spending. Ignored at first because it seemed politically impossible to implement, NSC 68 got a new lease on life from the Korean crisis. Korea saved us, Secretary of State Acheson later commented. Truman now ordered a massive military buildup, well beyond what was necessary for Korea. Soon the United States had 3.5 million men under their arms and was spending $50 billion per year on the defense budget, some 13% of the GNP. NSC 68 was a key document of the Cold War period, not only because it marked a major step in the militarization of American foreign policy, but also because it vividly reflected the sense of almost limitless possibility that pervaded post-war American society. NSC 68 rested on the assumption that the enormous American economy could bear without strain the enormous costs of a gigantic rearmament program. Said one NSC 68 planner, there was practically nothing the country could not do if it wanted to do it. Truman took full advantage of a temporary Soviet absence from the United Nations Security Council on June 25, 1950, to obtain a unanimous condemnation of North Korea as an aggressor. Why the Soviets were absent remains controversial. Scholars once believed that the Soviets were just as surprised as the Americans by the attack. It now appears that Stalin had given his reluctant approval to North Korea's strike plan, but believed that the fighting would be brief and that the United States would take little interest in it. The Security Council also called upon all UN members, including the United States, to render every assistance to restore peace. 2 days later, without consulting Congress, Truman ordered American air and naval units to support South Korea. Before the week was out, he also ordered General Douglas MacArthur's Japan-based occupation troops into action alongside the beleaguered South Koreans. So began the ill-fated Korean War. Officially, the United States was simply participating in a United Nations police action. Participating nations, including Great Britain, Canada, and the Philippines, did make significant troop contributions, but the United States provided 88% of the UN contingents, and General MacArthur, UN commander of the entire operation, took his orders from Washington, not from the Security Council. The military seesaw in Korea. Rather than fight his way out of the southern Pusan perimeter, MacArthur launched a daring amphibious landing behind the enemy's lines in Incheon. This bold gamble on September 15, 1950, succeeded brilliantly. Within 2 weeks, the North Koreans had scrambled back behind the sanctuary of the 38th parallel. Truman's avowed intentions was to restore South Korea to its former borders, but the pursuing South Koreans had already crossed the 38th parallel, and there seemed little point in permitting the North Koreans to regroup and come again. The UN General Assembly tactfully authorized a crossing by MacArthur, whom President Truman ordered northward, provided that there were no armed intervention by the Chinese or Soviets. The Americans thus raised the stakes in Korea, and in doing so quickened the fears of another potential player in this dangerous game. The Chinese had publicly warned that they would not sit idly by and watch hostile troops approach the strategic Yalu River boundary between Korea and China. But MacArthur pooh-poohed all predictions of an effective intervention by the Chinese, and reportedly boasted that he would have the boys home by Christmas. MacArthur erred badly. In November 1950, tens of thousands of Chinese volunteers fell upon his rashly overextended lines and hurled the UN forces, reeling back down the peninsula. The fighting now sank into a frostbitten stalemate on the icy terrain near the 38th parallel. An imperious MacArthur, humiliated by this rout, pressed for drastic retaliation. He favored a blockade of the Chinese coast and bombardment of Chinese bases in Manchuria. He even suggested that the United States use nuclear weapons on the advancing Chinese and their supply lines. But Washington policymakers, with ancient eyes on Moscow, refused to enlarge the already costly conflict. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff declared that a wider clash in Asia would be the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy. Europe, not Asia, was the administration's first concern, and the USSR, not China, loomed as the more sinister foe. Two-fisted General MacArthur felt that he was being asked to fight with one hand tied behind his back. He sneered at the concept of a limited war and insisted that there is no substitute for victory. Truman bravely resisted calls for nuclear escalation. When MacArthur began to criticize the president's policies publicly, Truman had no choice but to remove the insubordinate general from command, which he did on April 11, 1951. In July, truce discussions began in a rude field tent near the firing line, but were almost immediately snagged on the issue of prisoner exchange. Talks dragged on unproductively for nearly 2 years while men continued to die. Meanwhile, MacArthur, a legend in his own mind, returned to an uproarious American welcome, whereas in many circles Truman was condemned as a pig, an imbecile, a Judas, and an appeaser of communism. This domestic response to the Truman-MacArthur conflict offered just a hint of the depth of a popular passions coursing through the Cold War at home. Their sensational trail and electrocution, combined with sympathy for their two orphan children, began to sour some sober citizens on the excess of the Red Hunters. Was America really riddled with Soviet spies? Soviet agents did infiltrate certain government agencies, though without severely damaging consequences. And espionage may have helped the Soviets develop an atomic bomb somewhat sooner than they would have otherwise. Truman's loyalty program thus has a basis in reality, but for many ordinary Americans, the hunt for communists was not just about fending off the military threat of the Soviet Union. Unsettling dangers lurked closer to home. While men like Nixon and the Senator Joseph McCarthy led the search for communists in Washington, conservative politicians at the state and local levels discovered that all manner of social changes, including declining regional sentiment, increased sexual freedom, and agitation for civil rights, could conveniently be tarred with a red brush. Anti-communist crusaders ransacked school libraries for subversive textbooks and drove debtors, drinkers, and homosexuals, all alleged to be security risks, from their jobs. Some Americans, including President Truman, realized that the Red Hunt was turning into a witch hunt. In 1950, Truman vetoed the McCarran Internal Security Bill, which, among other provisions, authorized the president to arrest and detain suspicious people during an internal security emergency. Critics protested that the bill smacked of police state concentration camp tactics, but the congressional guardians of the Republic's liberties enacted the bill over Truman's veto. The demagogic politics of anti-communism found its most dangerous practitioner in Joseph R. McCarthy, an obstreperous Republican senator from Wisconsin, elected to the Senate on the basis of a trumped-up war hero record. The swaggering senator crashed into the limelight in February 1950 when he accused Secretary of State Dean Acheson of knowingly employing 205 Communist Party members. Pressed to reveal the names, McCarthy later conceded that there were only 57 genuine communists, and in the end failed to identify even one. Some of McCarthy's Republican colleagues, nevertheless, realized the partisan usefulness of this kind of attack on the Democratic administration. Ohio Senator John Bricker reportedly said, "Joe, you're a dirty SOB, but there are times when you've got to be an SOB around, and this is one of them." McCarthy's rhetoric grew bolder and his accusations spread more wildly over the next several years. He saw the red hand of Moscow everywhere. The Democrats, he charged, bent to whispered pleas from the lips of traitors. Incredibly, he even denounced General George Marshall, former Army Chief of Staff and ex-Secretary of State, as part of a conspiracy so immense and infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. McCarthy, and what would become known as McCarthyism, flourished in the setting Cold War atmosphere of suspicion and fear. The senator, neither the first nor the most effective Red Hunter, but he was surely the most ruthless, and he did the most damage to American tradition of fair play and free speech. The careers of countless officials, writers, and actors were ruined after Low Blow Joe had named them, often unfairly, as communists and communist sympathizers. Politicians trembled in the face of such onslaughts, especially when opinion polls show that a majority of the American people approved of McCarthy's crusade. At the peak of his powers, McCarthy effectively controlled personal policy at the State Department. One baleful result was severe damage to the morale and effectiveness of the professional foreign service. In particular, McCarthy purges deprived the government of a number of Asian specialists who might have counseled a wiser course in Vietnam in the fateful decade that followed. McCarthy's antics also damaged America's international reputation for fair and open democracy at a moment when it was important to keep Western Europe on the United States' side. McCarthy finally bent the blow too far when he attacked the U.S. Army. The embattled military men fought back in 35 days of televised hearings in the spring of 1954. Up to 20 million Americans at a time watched the Army McCarthy hearings. in fascination, while a boorish surly, McCarthy publicly cut his own throat by parading his essential meanness, and irresponsibility. A few months later, the Senate formally condemned him for conduct unbecoming a member. 3 years later, unwept and unsung, McCarthy died of chronic alcoholism, but McCarthyism has passed into the English language as a label for dangerous forces of unfairness and fear that a democratic society can unleash at its peril. Beyond fights over security and civil liberties, the Cold War shaped American culture in complex and profound ways. Many Americans interpreted the conflict between the capitalistic West and the communist and officially secular East in religious terms. Truman found support for casting the Cold War as a battle between good and evil theologians like the influential liberal Protestant clergyman Reinhold Niebuhr, 1892 to 1971, a vocal enemy of fascism, communism, and pacifism in the 1940s and 1950s. Niebuhr divided the world into two polarized camps, the children of the light and the children of darkness. For Niebuhr, Christian justice, including force if necessary, required a realist response to children of darkness, like Hitler and Stalin. But Niebuhr's realism also emphasized the dangers of fallibility and the limits of power, in contrast to the more crusading spirit of conservative Christian anti-communists. The post-war decades saw an emphasis on religious belief of any kind as a distinguishing feature of the American way, to be defended against atheistic communism. Congress's decision to insert the words "under God" under the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954 epitomized the Cold War impulse. The Cold War influenced domestic policies and society in other ways. Radical voices in institutions ranging from unions and universities to churches and civic organizations were muzzled. Among those voices were some of the most forceful advocates for racial justice in the United States. Even moderate agitators for civil rights were often slandered as communists and fellow travelers. But at the same time, competition with the Soviets for international support, like the earlier Allied fight against fascism during World War II, placed pressure on the United States to live up to its own stated democratic ideals. This created new political opportunities and rhetorical tools for advocates to press civil rights claims. An early example of the new international politics of civil rights came in 1948, when President Truman issued his landmark Executive Order 9981, desegregating the armed forces. Post-war economic anxieties. The communist menace was not the only specter haunting Americans after World War II. Economic uncertainty also loomed over the new peace. The decade of the 1930s had left deep scars. Joblessness and insecurity had pushed up the suicide rate and dampened the marriage rate. Babies were unborn as pinched budgets and sagging self-esteem wrought a sexual depression in American bedrooms. The war had banished the blight of depression, but would the respite last? Grim-faced observers were warning that the war had only temporarily lifted the pall of economic stagnation, and that peace would bring the return of hard times. Homeward bound GIs, so the gloomy predictions ran, would step out of the Army's chow lines and back into the breadlines of the unemployed. The faltering economy of the initial post-war years threatened to confirm the worst predictions of the doomsayers who foresaw another Great Depression. Real gross national product, GNP, slumped sickeningly in 1946 and 1947 from its wartime peak. With the removal of wartime price controls, prices levitated by 33% in 1946 to 1947. An epidemic of strikes swept through the country. During 1946 alone, some 4.6 million laborers laid down their tools, fearful that they could barely afford the autos and other consumer goods the war commandeer factories would soon manufacture. The growing muscle of organized labor deeply annoyed many conservatives. They had their revenge against labor's New Deal gains in 1947, when a Republican-controlled Congress, the first in 14 years, passed the Taft-Hartley Act over President Truman's vigorous veto. Labor leaders condemned the Taft-Hartley Act as a slave labor law. It outlawed the closed, all-union shop made unions liable for damages that resulted from jurisdictional disputes amongst themselves and required union leaders to take a non-communist oath. Taft-Hartley was only one of several obstacles that slowed the growth of organized labor in the years after World War II. In the heady days of the New Deal, unions had spread swiftly in the North, especially in huge manufacturing industries like steel and automobiles. But labor's post-war efforts to organize in the historically anti-union regions of the South and the West proved frustrating. The CIO's Operation Dixie, aimed at unionizing Southern textile workers and steelworkers, failed miserably in 1948 to overcome white workers' lingering fears of racial mixing. Anti-communist purges removed from labor's ranks some of the most active organizers. And most importantly, workers in the rapidly growing service sector of the economy proved much more difficult to organize than the thousands of assembly line workers who in the 1930s had poured into the auto and steel unions. Organized labor played a significant role in shaping the economic and political order in the United States for several decades after World War II, but the number of organized private sector workers would peak in the 1950s and then begin a long, slow decline that had yet to reverse over a half-century later. The Democratic administration, meanwhile, took some steps to forestall an economic downturn. It sold war factories and other government installations to private businesses at fire sale rates. It secured passage of the Employment Act of 1946, making a government policy to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. The act created a 3-member Council of Economic Advisors to provide the president with the data and the recommendations to make that policy a reality. Most dramatic was the passage of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill of Rights, or the GI Bill. Enacted partly out of fear that the employment markets would never be able to absorb 15 million returning veterans at war's end, the GI Bill tided ex-soldiers over as members of the 5220 Club, $20 a week for up to 52 weeks, and made generous provisions for sending the former soldiers to school. In the post-war decades, some 8 million veterans advanced their education at Uncle Sam's expense. The majority attended technical and vocational schools, but colleges and universities were crowded to the blackboards as more than 2 million ex-GIs stormed the halls of higher learning. The total eventually spent for education was some $14.5 billion in taxpayer dollars, $2 billion more than the Marshall Plan. The act also enabled Veterans Administration, VAA, to guarantee about $16 billion in loans for veterans to buy homes, farms, and small businesses. By raising educational levels and stimulating the construction industry, the GI Bill powerfully nurtured the robust and long-living economic expansion that eventually took hold in the late 1940s and profoundly shaped the post-war era. Democratic divisions in 1948. Attacking high prices and high-tax Harry Truman, the Republicans had won control of the Congress in the congressional elections of 1946. Their prospects had seldom looked rosier as they gathered in Philadelphia to choose their 1948 presidential candidates. They noisily renominated warmed-over New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, still as debonair as if he had stepped out of a bandbox. Also gathering in Philadelphia, Democratic politicos looked without enthusiasm on their hand-me-down president and sang, "I'm just mild about Harry." But a dump Truman movement collapsed when the war hero Dwight D. Eisenhower refused to be drafted. The peppery president, unwanted but undaunted, was then chosen in the face of vehement opposition by Southern delegates, alienated by his strong stand in favor of civil rights for blacks, especially his desegregation of the military. Truman's nomination split the party wide open. Embittered Southern Democrats from 13 states, like their fire-eating forebears of 1860, met in their own convention in Birmingham, Alabama, with their Confederate flags brashly in evidence. Amid scenes of heated defiance, these Dixiecrats nominated Governor J. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina on a states' rights party ticket. To add to the confusion within Democratic ranks, former Vice President Henry A. Wallace threw his hat into the ring. Having parted company with the administration over its get-tough-with-Russia policy, he was nominated by the New Progressive Party, a bizarre collection of disgruntled former New Dealers, starry-eyed pacifists, well-meaning liberals, and communist fronters. Wallace, a vigorous, though perhaps unrealistic liberal, assailed Uncle Sam's dollar imperialism from the stump. Considered by some the Pied Piper of Politburo, he took a Soviet-friendly line that earned him drenching with raw eggs in hostile cities. But to his supporters, Wallace raised the only hopeful voice in the deepening gloom of the Cold War. With the Democrats ruptured 3 ways and the Republican congressional victory of 1946 just passed, Dewey's victory seemed assured. Cold, smug, and overconfident, he confined himself to dispensing soothing syrup trivialities like, "Our future lies before us." The seemingly doomed Truman, with little money and few active supporters, had to rely on his gut-fighter instincts and folksy personality. Traveling the country by train to deliver some 300 "Give 'em hell" speeches, he lashed out at the Taft-Hartley slave labor law and the do-nothing Republican Congress, while whipping up support for his program of civil rights, improved labor benefits, and health insurance. On election night, the Chicago Tribune ran off an early edition with the headline, "Dewey Defeats Truman," but in the morning it turned out that President Dewey had snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Truman had swept to a stunning triumph, to the complete bewilderment of politicians, pollsters, prophets, and pundits. Even though Thurman took away 39 electoral votes in the Deep South, Truman won 303 electoral votes, primarily from the South, Midwest, and West, besting Dewey's largely Eastern-based 189 total. To make the victory sweeter, the Democrats retained control of Congress as well, thanks especially to support from Republican-wary farmers, workers, and African Americans. Smiling and self-assured, Truman sounded a clarion note in the 4th point of his inaugural address, known thereafter as Point 4. The plan was to lend U.S. money and technical aid to underdeveloped lands to help themselves. Truman wanted to spend millions to keep underprivileged people from becoming communists rather than spend billions to shoot them after they had become communists. This far-seeing program was officially launched in 1950, and it brought badly needed assistance to impoverished countries, notably in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. At home, Truman outlined a sweeping Fair Deal program in his 1949 message to Congress. It called for improved housing, full employment, national health insurance, and higher minimum wage, better farm price supports, new TVAs, and an extension of Social Security. But most of the Fair Deal fell victim to congressional opposition from Republicans and Southern Democrats. The only major successes came in the raising the minimum wage, providing for public housing in the Housing Act of 1949, and extending old age insurance to many more beneficiaries through the Social Security Act of 1950. Short-term legislative obstacles to reform, however, paled against this seismic shift in the domestic economy that brought substantial improvements to many Americans' lives. The long economic boom, 1950 to 1970. Gross national product began to climb haltingly in 1948. Then, beginning in 1950, the American economy surged onto a dazzling path of sustained growth that was to last virtually uninterrupted for 2 decades. America's economic performance became the envy of the world. National income nearly doubled in the 1950s and almost doubled again in the 1960s, shooting through the $1 trillion mark in 1973. Americans, some 6% of the world's people, were enjoying about 40% of the planet's wealth. Nothing loomed larger in the history of the post-World War II era than this fantastic eruption of affluence. It did not enrich all Americans, and it did not touch all people evenly, but it transformed the lives of a majority of citizens and molded the agenda of politicians and society for at least 2 generations. Prosperity underwrote social mobility. It paved the way for the eventual success of the civil rights movement. It funded vast new welfare programs like Medicare, and it gave Americans the confidence to exercise some unprecedented international leadership in the Cold War era. As a gusher of post-war prosperity poured forth its riches, Americans drank deeply from the Gilded Goblet. Millions of depression-pitched souls sought to make up for the sufferings in the 1930s. They determined to get theirs while the getting was good. A people who had once considered a chicken in every pot the standard of comfort and security now hungered for 2 cars in every garage, swimming pools in their backyards, vacation homes, and gas-guzzling recreational vehicles. The size of the middle class, defined as households earning between $3,000 and $10,000 a year, doubled from pre-Great Depression days and included 60% of the American people by the mid-1950s. By the end of the decade, the vast majority of American families owned their own cars and washing machines, and nearly 90% owned a television set, a gadget invented in the 1920s, but virtually unknown until the late 1940s. In another revolution of sweeping consequences, almost 60% of American families owned their own homes by 1960, and compared with the less than 40% in the 1920s. Of all the beneficiaries of post-war prosperity, none reaped greater rewards than women. More than ever, urban offices and shops provided a bonanza of employment for female workers. The great majority of new jobs were created in the post-war era went to women, as the service sector of the economy dramatically outgrew the old industrial and manufacturing sectors. Women accounted for a quarter of the American workforce at the end of World War II, and for nearly half the labor pool 5 decades later. Yet even as women continued their march into the workplace in the 1940s and 1950s, popular culture glorified the traditional feminine roles of homemaker and mother. The clash between the prescriptive demands of suburban housewifery and the realities of employment eventually sparked a feminist revolt in the 1960s. The roots of post-war prosperity. What propelled this unprecedented economic explosion? The Second World War itself provided a powerful stimulus. While other countries had been ravaged by years of fighting, the United States had used the war crisis to fire up its smokeless factories and rebuild its depression-plagued economy. Invigorated by battle, America had almost effortlessly come to dominate the ruined global landscape of the post-war period. Ominously, much of the glittering prosperity of the 1950s and 1960s rested on the underpinnings of the colossal military budgets, leading some critics to speak of a permanent war economy. The economic upturn of 1950 was fueled by massive appropriations for the Korean War, and defense spending accounted for some 10% of the GNP throughout the ensuing decade. Pentagon dollars primed the pumps of high-technology industries such as aerospace, plastics, and electronics, areas in which the United States reigned supreme over all foreign competitors. The Cold War military budget also financed much scientific research and development, R&D, hence the name of one of the most famous think tanks, the Rand Corporation. More than ever before, unlocking the secret of nature was the key to unleashing economic growth. Cheap energy also fed the economic boom. American and European economies controlled the flow of abundant petroleum from the sandy expanses of the Middle East and kept prices low. Americans doubled their consumption of inexpensive and seemingly inexhaustible oil in a quarter century after the war. Anticipating a limitless future of low-cost fuels, they flung out the endless ribbons of highways, installed air conditioning in their homes, and engineered a 6-fold increase in the country's electricity generating capacity between 1945 and 1970. Spidery grids of electrical cables carried the pent-up power of oil, gas, coal, and falling water to activate the tools of workers on the factory floor. With the forces of nature increasingly harnessed at their hands, workers chalked up spectacular gains in productivity. In the 2 decades after the outbreak of the Korean War, productivity increased at an average rate of more than 3% per year. Gains in productivity were also enhanced by the rising education level in the workforce. By 1970, nearly 90% of the school-age population was enrolled in educational institutions, a dramatic contrast with the opening years of the century, when only half of this age group had attended school. Better educated and better equipped, American workers in the 1970s could produce nearly twice as much in an hour's labor as they had done in 1950. Productivity was key to prosperity. Rising productivity in the 1950s and 1960s virtually doubled the average American's standard of living in the post-war quarter century. When the link between productivity gains and income growth began to rupture in the 1970s, it signaled the beginning of an end of the post-war golden age. Also contributing to the vigor of the post-war economy were some momentous changes in the nation's basic economic structure. Conspicuous was the accelerating shift of the workforce out of agriculture, which achieved productivity gains virtually unmatched by any other economic sector. The family farm nearly became an antique artifact as consolidation produced giant agribusiness able to employ costly machinery. Thanks largely to mechanization and to rich new fertilizers, as well as to government subsidies and price supports, one farm worker by the century's end could produce food for over 50 people, compared with the 15 people in the 1940s. Farmers whose forebears had busted soil with oxen or horses now plowed their fields with air-conditioned tractor cabs, listening on their stereophonic radios to the weather forecasts or the latest Chicago commodities market quotations. Once the mighty backbone of the agricultural republic, and still some 15% of the labor force at the end of World War II, farmers made up a slim 2% of working Americans by the turn of the 21st century, yet they fed much of the world. The smiling Sunbelt. The convulsive economic changes of the post-1945 period shook and shifted the American people, amplifying the population redistribution set in motion by World War II. As immigrants and westward trekking pioneers, Americans had always been a people on the move, but they were astonishingly footloose in the post-war years. For some 3 decades after 1945, an average of 30 million people changed residences every year. Families especially felt the strain, as distance divided parents from children and brothers from sisters from one another. One sign of this sort of stress was the phenomenal popularity of advice books on child rearing, especially Dr. Benjamin Spock's The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care. First published in 1945, it instructed millions of parents during the ensuing decades in the kind of homely wisdom that was once transmitted naturally from grandparent to parent. In fluid post-war neighborhoods, friendships were also hard to sustain. Mobility could exact a high human cost in loneliness and isolation. Especially striking was the growth of the Sun Belt, a 15-state area stretching in a smiling crescent from Virginia through Florida and Texas to Arizona and California. This region increased its population at a rate nearly double of the old industrial zones of the Northeast, the Frost Belt. In the 1950s, California alone accounted for 1/5 of the entire nation's population growth, and in 1963 had outdistanced New York as the most populous state, a position it still holds in the early decades of the 21st century, with more than 38 million people, or more than 1 out of every 8 Americans. See, guys, this means California is the best state. The Sun Belt was a new frontier for Americans after World War II. Modern pioneers came in search of jobs, a better climate, and lower taxes. Jobs they found in abundance, especially in the California electronics industry, in the aerospace complexes in Florida and in Texas, and in the huge military installations that powerful Southern congressional representatives secured for the districts. A Niagara of federal dollars accounted for much of the Sunbelt's prosperity, though, ironically, Southern and Western politicians led the cry against government spending. By the early 21st century, states in the South and West were annually receiving some $444 billion more in federal funds than those in the Northeast and Midwest. A new economic war between the states seemed to be shaping up. Northeasterners and their allies from the hard-hit heavy industry region of Ohio Valley, the Rust Belt, tried to rally political support with a sarcastic slogan, "The North shall rise again." These dramatic shifts of population and wealth further broke the historic grip of the North on the nation's political life. Every elected occupant of the White House from 1964 to 2008 hailed from the Sun Belt, and the region's congressional representation rose as its population grew. The rush to the suburbs, In all regions, America's modern migrants, if they were white, fled from the cities to the burgeoning new suburbs in the initial post-war decades. While other industrial countries struggled to rebuild their war-ravaged cities, government policies in the United States encouraged movement away from the urban centers. Federal Housing Administration, FHA, and Veterans Administration, VA, home loan guarantees made it more economically attractive to own a home in the suburbs than to rent an apartment in the city. Tax deductions for interest payments on home mortgages provided additional financial incentive, and government-built highways that sped commuters from suburban homes to city jobs further facilitated this mass migration. By 1960, 1 in every 4 Americans dwelt in suburbia, and a half-century later, more than half the nation's population did. The construction industry boomed in the late 1950s and 1960s to satisfy this demand, pioneered by innovators like the Levitt brothers, whose first Levittown sprouted on New York's Long Island in the 1940s. Builders revolutionized the techniques of home construction, erecting hundreds or even thousands of dwellings in a single project. Specialized crews working from standardized plans laid foundations, while others raised factory-assembled framing modules, put on roofs, strung wires, installed plumbing, and finished the walls in record time and with cost-cutting efficiency. Snooty critics wailed about the aesthetic monotony of the suburban tract developments, but eager home buyers nevertheless moved into them by the millions. White flight to the leafy green suburbs left the inner cities, especially those in the Northeast and Midwest, black, brown, and broke. The migrating blacks from the South filled up the urban neighborhoods that were abandoned by the departing white middle class. Tax-paying businesses fled with their affluent customers from downtown shops to suburban shopping malls, another World War II invention. Government policies sometimes aggravated this spreading pattern of residential segregation. FHA administrators, citing the risk of making loans to blacks and other unharmonious racial or nationality groups, often refused them mortgages for private home purchases, thus limiting black mobility out of the inner cities and driving many minorities into public housing projects. Even public housing programs frequently followed a so-called neighborhood composition rule, which effectively built housing for blacks in neighborhoods that were already identified as predominantly black, thus solidifying racial separation. The government supported racial discrimination not only worsened segregation, but also fed the long-term wealth gap between whites and blacks, since most Americans' wealth consists primarily of the value of their homes. The post-war baby boom. Alongside its economic boom, America experienced an equally dramatic baby boom. The huge leap in the birth rate in the decade and a half after 1945. Confident young men and women tied their nuptial knot in record numbers at war's end, and they began to immediately to fill the nation's empty cradles. They thus touched off a demographic explosion that added more than 50 million bawling babies to the nation's population by the end of the 1950s. The soaring birth rate finally crested in 1957 and was followed by a deepening birth dearth. By 1973, fertility rates had dropped below the point necessary to maintain existing population figures without further immigration. This boom or bust cycle of births begot a bulging waves among the American population curve. As the oversized post-war generation grew to maturity, it was destined, like the fabled pig passing through the python, to strain and distort many aspects of American life. Elementary school enrollment, for example, swelled to nearly 34 million pupils in 1970. Then began a steady decline as the onward marching age group left in its wake closed schools and unemployed teachers. The maturing babies of the post-war boom sent economic shockwaves undulating through the decades. As tykes and toddlers in the 1940s and 50s, they made up a lucrative market for manufacturers of canned food and other baby products. As teenagers in the 1960s, the same youngsters spent an estimated $20 billion a year for clothing and recorded rock music. and their sheer numbers laid the basis of the much ballyhooed youth culture of that tumultuous decade. In the 1970s, the most popular jeans maker began marketing pants with a fuller cut for those former kids who could no longer squeeze into their size 30 Levi's. In the 1980s, the horde of baby boomers bumped and jostled one another in the job market, struggling to get a foothold on the crowded ladder of social mobility. As the boomers entered middle age, a secondary boom of children peaked in the 1990s, a faint demographic echo of the post-war population explosion. The impact of the huge post-war generation will continue to ripple through American society well into the 21st century, as members pass into retirement and place enormous strains on the Social Security and Medicare systems.